Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. My guest today is Robert DiBlasio, the Gentle Rambler, who is returning after being on the show back in 2020 or 2021 before Kennedy Cooper and I broke up. And so welcome back, Robert. How have you been doing?
I'm pretty good. I'm still doing the Gentle Rambler podcasts semi-weekly. I also write for thedangerousglobe.com. I've been doing that since those 2021. And, just trying to survive in this economy and everything, especially where I live. I live in the New York City metro area, so it's very expensive.
Not cheap, yeah.
No, it's difficult.
I live in the Portland metro, and it's not cheap here, but nothing like New York City.
Oh, no, and that's what it is. It's difficult to, to keep the show performing when you just got to make sure that, that everything is set, economically. But it's still, it's fun to do it. I'm glad to be back here talking with you.
The reason this is on Sunday mornings is because I work a full-time job Monday to Friday.
Yep.
And I don't want to do it Sunday night because, I go back to work on Monday. So
yeah, Sunday morning is nice.
The best time.
Yeah, Sunday mornings are lovely.
Plus, this gives me the chance to give people who wanted an alternative to the annoying, boring, repetitive conversations they're getting on the Sunday morning news shows on network TV, where
I was just watching
everybody's either complaining about Trump or complaining about people complaining about Trump.
Yeah, it's redundant. It's redundancy. I was just watching CBS. Well, actually, maybe I shouldn't use the actual outlet's name, but yeah, I was watching a Sunday morning CBS show, and it's Trump 24 hours a day, and then it's like almost natural human nature to start to like sympathize with him in a strange sort of way.
Well, somebody was tweeting about this the other day. We're supposed to be talking about Syria, and I'm going to get into this, but this actually, somebody was tweeting the other day. Chuck Modi, great justice reporter, sports reporter too, really knowledgeable on sports, but a great justice reporter who lots of great news about what's going on as far as protests and activism and what the government is doing that they shouldn't be doing. He said that, 90% of anti-Trump media helps Trump by focusing on whatever Trump wants people to focus on instead of on what's actually important.
Exactly. And it's like, you look at some certain research on the whole thing with him becoming a felon and, basically, the impeachment. It's almost like, and almost aided his whole effort to be reelected.
Harping on Trump being a felon ironically elevates the kind of right-wing labeling about these people that the Democrats are supposed to be against. And then the Democrats pointing out that Trump is a felon at the same time that Joe Biden pardons Hunter Biden.
Yeah, of course.
Which, it is true that Hunter Biden was only being prosecuted because Trump was being prosecuted. That's absolutely true.
Sure.
But at the same time, when they say that the Burisma story is a phony bribery scandal, that's bullshit. The only reason people like Hunter Biden get jobs on corporate boards in foreign countries is because those companies want to influence the U.S. government, and so they give board positions to prominent Americans they think have connections.
Yeah, like what is he, a gas expert? I mean,
What's his expertise in Ukraine, in the national gas industry, in government policy. Oh, he is related to an American vice president when he was appointed to the board. Maybe that matters.
There's no better name recognition or name dropping you could do than that. And then he becomes a president. And It's similar though, you know. I mean, I think it's going to become it's going to be a recurring theme with the two party system. Once they impeach Trump, it's like you opened up Pandora's box, and now they tried to impeach Biden for whatever the fuck they want to impeach presidents for these days. You know, it's always something.
The excuse for not pursuing the CIA torture scandal under Obama was that we don't prosecute our political opponents.
Yeah.
Now,
that's changed.
If we're supposed to believe that standard, we don't prosecute our political opponents, even when they commit crimes, because it's wrong to prosecute our political opponents, then the Democrats look really bad going after Trump because they're violating everything they've told everybody, and they're doing it over, and they were doing it over. It was clear they were going out of their way to get Trump because they had lost an election to him. And now that they had won the election, they wanted to make sure he couldn't run again.
Right.
And they just guaranteed he would run again with all those prosecutions because they gave him no other choice.
And then when he brings up the deep state thing, it sounds ridiculous at first, right? But it almost, what you just stated was like, it seems like he's not part of a club. You know,
he is part of the club, but there's a whole other argument about that. But he definitely, because of the way the Democrats go after him, it looks like he's not part of the club.
Right. Yeah.
Now, of course, if he really weren't part of the club, he wouldn't have magically escaped all consequences the way he did.
Right. That's not just a wealth thing. That's a
part of the club thing. Escaping all consequences requires being enough part of the club that people really don't want to push the law the way they should.
Absolutely.
And you can say it's just because, you can't put the president in jail, but why can't you? If we really care about all this law and order bullshit, and it really matters that the president is a felon, then why can't you sentence the felon president to prison? Well, it's because he's president and he can't do his job from prison. Well, we have a vice president and a speaker of the House and a cabinet, all these people who can step up if the president can't do his job.
None of us can do our jobs from prison.
No reason we can't put the president in prison and let the vice president do his job.
Right.
I mean, that's sort of the point.
I guess when they
But now,
go ahead.
Sorry. I want to go ahead and cut us back to the right subject now.
Yes,
and this is a good place to do
Trump.
it. Because I mentioned the CIA torture scandal. So this is a good place to sort of come into the history of the U.S. and Syria. Where was the country that what were the two countries that all the renditions were happening to because they were U.S. allies and it was legal to torture prisoners? Pakistan and Syria.
Yeah, and when did that change? What was it? Was it ISIS? Fighting ISIS.
And this is
the ultimate evil terrorist shadow group. Was it that?
This is a very good question, and where it changed was what they were calling the Arab Spring.
Yes,
and the supposed democratic uprising against Bashar Assad, our ally who ran the torture prisons that the CIA locked alleged terrorists in so they could torture them. I repeat this for a reason. The Arab Spring seemed like a good PR excuse for Barack Obama to get behind democracy. And so there was a lot of we support democracy stuff going on, and at least a lot of pro-democracy rhetoric as regarded Tunisia and what was going on there. Yeah. And a lot of pro-democracy rhetoric initially around Yemen and what was going on there, though it's worth noting that the pro-democracy movement in Yemen is the very people that we're paying the Saudis and Emiratis to bomb for us now and who we're now bombing ourselves.
Yeah. So, if you think about where we were in the Arab Spring and Obama was coming. Obama was already in the White House.
He was in the White House for a little while, and the Arab Spring seemed like this great way to reset from the war on terror, or at least it appeared to.
Right, and you mentioned Tunisia. I believe that was like the original.
Tunisia was the very first one, and then there were
movements. Positive. It seemed like it was.
It was very positive until the U.S. government decided they didn't like the Tunisian government after all. But that's another whole different story too.
But then it went on to Egypt, and they have, more or less an authoritarian.
The U.S. didn't like that the democratically elected president of Egypt was the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, even though he had sworn to uphold the new constitution, which was democratic and secular. He had promised to not try to violate the constitution. He was going to guarantee religious freedoms and all that. And he seemed to be doing a good job. It was just that the U.S. decided, no, we can't have the Muslim Brotherhood running Egypt. And so they backed al-Sisi in a very violent military coup. Al-Sisi is a very brutal tyrant who runs a military police state and is backed by a junta.
We like that until it doesn't work out for us anymore. Democracy is great, unless it's a democratic government that we don't like.
But what's hilarious, now I don't like her. I think there are lots of problems with Tulsi Gabbard. But now MSNBC is trying to paint Tulsi Gabbard as pro-Russian because she visited al-Sisi. But al-Sisi's a U.S. client, not a Russian client. He's a brutal tyrant, but he's a brutal tyrant for the U.S. because the U.S. didn't want the Muslim Brotherhood running Egypt.
Right. The democracy they set up
didn't go the way they wanted it to go.
Yeah. Democracy is wonderful as long as the United States is behind the democracy that's being put in place and can basically tell it what to do. And the Muslim Brotherhood seemed pretty like they weren't going to play that game, and they were going to try to, like you just said, protect their own constitution.
The Muslim Brotherhood is first and foremost an Arab nationalist organization that opposes the sort of governments that the West sets up, these al-Sisi police states and Bashar al-Assad police states.
Like Nasser in the 50s. I don't think the United States were too crazy about him, but the Egyptians.
So that's a good place to start, actually, because Syria starts actually with Nasser.
Yeah.
Syria was a member of Gamal Abdel Nasser's United Arab Republic.
Yes.
Syria and Egypt were united as one country for a period of time as the United Arab Republic. There were 3 stars on the UAR flag. The third one was supposed to be, this country will be familiar to people who remember the Bush and Obama administrations. The third star was supposed to be Iraq.
Okay.
Because Iraq and Syria were both run by the same political movement, which was called the Ba'ath Party.
Ba'ath Party, right.
Now, the Ba'ath Party believed in a lot of the things that Gamal Abdel Nasser was saying in Egypt, which was, number one, Arab nationalism. Number 2, a secular Arab state that guaranteed freedom of religion to both Christians and Muslims, because Egypt had a very large Christian minority that Nasser wanted to reassure.
Yep.
And a basic socialistic economy.
Yeah, I was going to say the socialist overtones of the whole thing.
Nasser and Assad's father, the original President Assad of Syria, nationalized big foreign companies in Egypt and Syria.
Oh, yeah. That's your socialist overtones there. But, I mean, whatever was going to work for that part of the world was pretty much not going to work for the nation state of Israel as well.
Well, even before, I mean, and that's ironic, too. The first Israeli intervention in its neighbors was when Israel seized the Suez Canal after Nasser nationalized it. Israel
Right.
was back in seizing the Suez Canal by the British and French governments.
Yeah, I was going to mention that Eisenhower he stuck neutral in that.
Eisenhower ended up backing Egypt and
more or
basically
less
telling Israel they had to get out of the Suez or the U.S. would have to intervene. And so Israel left. And this was really a sort of hard threat. We will intervene if you continue to intervene. We want to see an independent Egypt with control of its own borders.
So, I mean, obviously the United States presidential office stance has changed so much since then, obviously.
Well, and this is the history. So prior to JFK, the United States was very pro-Arab. FDR had signed a security agreement with the person who became the king of Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
And that security agreement guaranteed the U.S. the lowest possible competitive oil price, which was to say that we were saying they could boost the price. They could raise the price up to a point to protect their own profits, but the U.S. had to have the very lowest agreed upon fair rate of exchange.
Well, I know they discovered or they found the oil, I believe, in the 30s in Saudi Arabia, right?
Yeah, and
we're talking pre-World War II.
Pre-World War II.
Oil there, and I guess
the U.S. was already exploiting the oil there when the agreement was signed, but the agreement as signed, because it was designed to fuel the military machine for World War II.
Right.
The agreement as signed was, we will protect your power in the Arabian Peninsula as long as you guarantee us oil for no more than X price.
Money, yeah. I guess.
And they negotiated that price so that there was a fair profit for the Saudis, but it was really cheap for the Americans.
I wanted to ask you real quick on Syria. What do you suppose? I mean, I just wonder. I ask people this that I discuss this about how, like, a civil war, which was 10 years on.
Well, the civil war is something we started after the whole Arab Spring thing.
Well, yeah, but like, what made it possible for the regime to fall so suddenly and so quickly?
Well, because
the lack of Russian support. I mean, is it
well,
that simple?
So what it appears, since you ask, and I only know this because this is guesswork from and things other people have said, other sources have said that seem like they make sense. There appears to be a consensus that there was some sort of deal made between Putin and Biden, knowing that Trump was coming into office anyway, and that Trump is not quite as supportive of the U.S.'s commitments in Ukraine as Biden is.
Well,
that there was sort of a deal made to allow that Russia would get out of Syria if the U.S. would stop backing Ukraine.
That sort of makes sense. I mean, because like
you now hear everybody talking about how Zelensky has to make concessions and there needs to be a peace agreement and Ukraine's going to have to give something up. You hear that a lot.
The signs are pointing to that. Trump just says a lot of shit. I'm not even
talking about Trump. I'm talking about all the national security people who are going to be criticizing Trump in other ways.
Right.
But are now saying we need to make a deal. Zelensky needs to make a deal with Putin to end the war. Yeah, and these are the very people who prevented him from ending the war when he first came into office.
That whole connection makes sense, though, Chris, with what you said there about the Russians, allowing that to happen, because it happened so swiftly that you figure.
And where did Assad go to be safe?
Oh, Russia. Of course, he's going to go to Russia. Yeah. He probably had tea the next morning, and
And that's what I feel about it. We'll tell Zelensky we can't write him a blank check anymore if you stop supporting Assad. That's what I think happened.
I guess that's a fair deal for both parties. I mean, it doesn't.
I mean, I'm not a big fan of geopolitics and imperialism.
No,
but I mean, as far as an imperialistic hegemon and an imperialized country that's sort of trying to push back and renegotiate its position within the empire, yeah, that's kind of a fair deal. That where Biden is sort of telling Putin, yeah, we're willing to sort of back off and let you have better relations. We know Trump's coming in and he likes you anyway, so if you do this, we'll do this, and we'll make the world a little safer, and we'll be able to pivot to China.
Yeah, and anything the spending to the Ukraine. I mean, it's just numbers after a while to me. Like you hear the numbers like keep rising. 151 billion. And it just becomes so ridiculous that people don't even really register.
And you notice it's Israel that's going into Syria in little ways that prop up the new government, and not the U.S. So the U.S. doesn't want to be engaged as much in this either. And it's because they want to be able to sort of start bullying China more than anything else.
Right. Well, we left it to Israel to bomb whatever they felt like needed to be bombed.
And that was basically Biden's policy. Israel bombs everyone, so we don't have to.
Yeah, that's where I was getting at. And that's awful. It's a terrible thing. And I was watching a mainstream news publication this morning, and you see Tony Blinken, speaking about, his upbringing and everything, or whatever the case is. And it's so like lackadaisical about. I also, real quick, I saw a travel show where the woman, she went to Syria for the New Year's Eve, this January, and she drove through Beirut, Lebanon, which I never really, watched anything like where you could actually see somebody driving through Beirut, and what a beautiful place it is. And then she hooked a left, and then all the buildings are bombed out, and it's like. That's like a real footage that they don't really want the mainstream media doesn't want anybody to see.
Take a look sometimes at some of the propaganda videos that Israel used to show of the nice parts of Gaza before they abandoned the city.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
And they say, well, God, look how great Gaza is, and the Palestinians aren't doing anything with it. And then the reality is that it doesn't look like that anymore. They've been bombing it and besieging it and starving it for more than...
Now it's a hill of rubble, and before it was just a large, very congested, population.
Well, I mean, so Gaza is the size. In order to have an idea of what we're talking about, area versus population, Gaza is the same size as the metropolitan area of Hobart, the capital of Tasmania in Australia. And Hobart is a city of, just a sec. Hobart is a city of just over 250,000 people. Just over 250,000 people. Now, this area, the size of a metropolitan complex holding just over 250,000 people, has 2.2 million people crammed into it.
Yes. So incredibly.
That's number one. This is the size of this is the same effective size as a city of 250,000 people, but with 2.2 million people crammed into it. That's number one. Number two, they dropped more ordnance on Gaza just from October 8th of 2023 to the end of that year as was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Wow.
And so you're dropping that much ordnance on such a small place with so many people concentrated into it.
Right, but they got to get rid of Hamas, right?
They got to get rid of Hamas.
If they drop enough bombs like that, if they drop that many bombs, eventually they're going to kill some Hamas militants, you would think, right? They use people as human shields, So got to get them somehow. I'm being sarcastic.
Here's where the definition of Hamas comes into play. Hamas is several things all at once. One, Hamas is a militant group fighting for the national self-determination of Palestine. Two, Hamas is a political party within the Palestinian system that was set up by the occupying Israeli government.
Okay.
Three, Hamas is the civil government of Gaza.
It was democratically elected originally. Or at least,
yes. Yeah. So when you drop a bomb on a judge's house and kill the judge and his whole family, the judge is technically a Hamas leader because he's a civil official in the civil government of Gaza, which makes him a Hamas leader.
Yeah, he works for Hamas. That's
but
great.
He's not in any way, he's in no way involved in terrorism. He's a member of the civil government of Gaza whose job is to be a judge and to try criminal or civil cases. He is not a terrorist. They're making loose use of the term Hamas to attack civilian infrastructure and say they're fighting Hamas.
Real quick, the doctors, right? It's a Gaza Health Ministry.
Yes,
so
the Gaza Health Ministry.
The Gaza Health Ministry. So the doctors work for Hamas.
Yes.
So I'm in the fucking hospital, and it's like, oh, we're killing Hamas because the doctors.
That's the technicality. That's the exact technicality they're hiding behind. That all these people are Hamas. Now, because all these people are Hamas, their families. In the case of the judges, their patients, in the case of the doctors, these are human shields.
Yeah, they all have a target on their back if they work for the government that's running the.
And this is what's so sick about it. They use this very loose definition of Hamas. Then they bomb people who are technically Hamas. And call the civilians around those people who are just going through their normal lives in the civil infrastructure of Gaza, human shields. And it's all a very disgusting lie based on the dishonest interpretation of a definition.
Right. And what I want to say about the part about the hospitals is, they went in there early on. They gave us like this footage of
all the bullshit, all the excuses. Now they're not even making excuses anymore.
What's the reasoning to continue to attack hospitals if everything is basically bombed out already? You already went inside the facility. You already went under the facility. So what else is there?
The doctors.
This is what a genocidal term is being thrown around. It's not just because people are anti-Semitic. You know what I mean? It's not.
Well, who did they kill in Cambodia? That's the perfect most recent example of a cut and dried. Everybody said it was a genocide at international law case.
Oh, Pol Pot. You said?
Yeah. Who did they kill in Cambodia?
Pol Pot, but yeah.
Who did Pol Pot kill? Pol Pot killed lawyers. He killed doctors. He killed judges. He killed anybody who was part of the civil infrastructure because he wanted to destroy the existing civil infrastructure of the country and rebuild it completely new and completely fresh.
Literally from scratch, yes.
Yes. And so this is what we're seeing Israel do to Palestinians. They're killing doctors, they're killing lawyers, they're killing judges, they're killing these professional people, they're killing journalists. They're targeting the very people that the civil infrastructure needs in order to exist so that they can come in and build completely from scratch.
Yeah. And as long as the mainstream media, and I noticed like when I was younger, when I first, younger, 20 years ago, like even the mainstream media, they'll throw some hints in there about how terrible it is that nobody can drink water and how many civilians are killed. But they never really, they kind of just like, they make sure to cover their bases.
I mean, the very hardest people on Israel in mainstream media will not come out and compare Israel to Cambodia under Pol Pot.
Never. No. And we just did it. Like it's a similar playbook. You know what I mean? Go to the sports term. It's a similar playbook. It's just a different, same terminology. Or it's
Zionism instead of this reactionary
socialism. Yeah.
Well, the best way to describe anything like that is Nazism, because that's where you get the so-called National Socialism.
National Socialist, yeah.
You want to so completely destroy something and completely rebuild it in this new pure, and that's the purity fetish. The purity fetish is a clue. When people say that they have to cleanse something, where they have to purify.
Purify is a good. It seems like Israel, though. It seems like the ideology is not the growing the first thing. It's more like, it's just like, is it about real estate? Is it simply about land? Because you look at the West Bank.
If you want me to get communist on you,
sure.
Then ultimately all politics comes down to control of resources and industrial capacity.
Materialism.
Control of resources, control of markets, ability to move commodities around from place to place, all this stuff, all the basic capitalist. The biggest is we want to be able to invest in some place and get our money out of it at a high return of profit at the expense of the people who actually live there. And that's where you get your imperialism.
Yeah. That's imperialism 101.
And so that's the materialist side of all this. And the materialist side of all this is ultimately what drives the machine, because you need to keep those profits going. And it's the people who need to keep those profits coming in who have the most influence on the rest of the system, because money is power in our political system.
Right. Going back to like Syria and countries in that part of the world, you think like maybe perhaps a more socialistic approach could work in an area like that? But you think about the religion that the majority of the population practices, and that's where
this takes us back to history. This takes us back to history.
Right.
Nasser and the original Assad, and to a lesser degree, the guy who Saddam Hussein took over from.
Yes.
And to a certain degree, even though he started up with the West in some ways, Saddam Hussein himself, what all these leaders were theoretically committed to was economic independence from the colonizing West, national control of their own resources, and socialist distribution of the product of those resources for the betterment of all their people.
Right.
So that was the theory behind both Nasserism in Egypt and Baathism in Syria and Iraq, which brings us to why Baathism worked in Syria for as long as it did. Assad's father was a member of a Shiite group called the Alawites.
Alawites, yes.
Who are a large minority in the country as a whole, and are the majority in a specific part of the country centered on Aleppo.
Okay. Oh, that's where the majority is, Aleppo. Okay.
Aleppo is the center of the Alawite area of Syria. the Alawites are a majority in that one part of the country and a minority
Right.
anywhere in the
And
whole
they're worried
country
about
as a
some
whole.
backlash too, because of
So this is where the whole genius of Baathism under Assad was that because it was secular, you could make all these power sharing deals to give all the religious groups a piece of the government. So officially, under their system, members of the Alawites were given preference in military promotions. Christians were given preference in certain political offices and business areas. The Sunni majority obviously had the quote unquote white privilege of being the majority ethnicity and religion in the country.
Right. So, I mean, that's how an easy way to look at how.
And so they had this proportional representation system. Under the French colonizers, Syria was cut up. Syria and Lebanon were cut up into something like 15 different provinces, each one with its own majority ethnic group was in charge and ran things, subject to the French governors.
Yeah, separatist.
And so it was very divide and rule that they let each group have its own autonomy and played them off against each other to maintain colonial power. And so the anti-colonial folks wanted to have power sharing agreements to unite all the Syrians against the colonizers.
Correct.
So the system of power sharing and proportional representation in Syria was based on ethnicity and religion and culture. And all these cultural groups had very specific roles within the government and business and military establishment. Something similar happened in Lebanon, where the commander-in-chief of the military and the president of the country have to be Christians, whereas the prime minister has to be a member of one Islamic group, and other cabinet ministers have to be members of other Islamic groups.
Well, that's I think that's a positive way to go about it.
I mean,
in theory, you'd think.
I don't judge it one way or the other. That is something that was seen as an acceptable solution by the people in Syria. That was their solution.
Yeah.
The Syrians installed this system. And it worked for them after they got rid of the French. Assad's father ruled for a very long time, was very successful, was an ally of Nasser, was very much involved in the non-aligned movement for as long as it lasted and was successful, who sort of became a Soviet ally later on out of necessity, and then who became a U.S. ally also out of necessity.
Right.
Despite the fact that Syria and Iraq had been allies before the invasion of Kuwait, Assad's father sided with the U.S. in the Gulf War.
Yeah.
And that was a big deal. And that was what established Bashar Assad as the U.S. ally in the war on terror. And why we were going to, torture dungeons in Syria and Pakistan specifically.
Right.
And then, then you have the Arab Spring, and Barack Obama is trying to disassociate himself from torture dungeons in every way he can without actually prosecuting the torturers.
Yeah.
And so it's jumping on the Arab Spring is like the perfect way for him to disassociate himself from George W. Bush's torture dungeons.
Do Arab Spring real quick. Anybody who was like really paying attention to Arab Spring should have known it went off the rails with Libya. I mean, that was really where.
Well, so let's talk about
longer like a fun, nice, positive, like even footage wise,
Let's talk about Libya, because there were multiple things going on in Libya at the same time. Gaddafi, who was more of a head of state than a head of government, He was the person who inaugurated their system, but there was a great deal of local autonomy, and most decisions were made locally by direct democracy, with national policy being something along the lines of administering and mediating disagreements between local groups.
It's almost like in Israel how the prime minister and the president, it's almost like a ceremony. Like in a sense,
that's a good way to look at it is how, yes, that the president of Israel or the president of India or the president of several other countries that are republics but have a prime minister and a parliamentary system,
right,
how the president is more of a ceremonial and diplomatic figure than an actual government figure.
So you're saying in Libya that was like what in reality what Gaddafi was
the actual reality of Libyan government is that 80 to 90% of domestic policy was made at a local level by by local assemblies in which direct democracy was the rule of the day. Now, foreign policy wise, because of the way the system was constructed, that's where Gaddafi had a lot of influence. He was their spokesman to the world. He was the person who was responsible for signing treaties and making agreements and such.
Right. He was more like it seemed like an ambassador. And
he was also the person who was supposed to mediate between their internal disagreements. If two local groups, if two neighboring counties are arguing with each other, they would go to Gaddafi to settle the agreement, or to people he appointed and work up the chain to Gaddafi.
Yeah, almost like a mafia boss. That's what it sounds like.
In the sense that any government starts out as a protection racket, sure.
Yeah. So it's no different than anything else.
but that said, it's like in some ways, that rule by the mafia boss is fairer and more equitable than the rule by the government would be.
Do you think it was his softening, like, visually?
Well, it comes down to simple. It comes down really simple. Gaddafi was working on a nuclear weapons program so that he couldn't be attacked. And when he gave up his nuclear weapons program, he was attacked. And I'm not, and I hate to say this because I really love the idea of deproliferation.
Sure.
But as long as the United States is the most powerful military force in the world, countries shouldn't give up their nukes. Look at what happened to Ukraine and Libya and Iraq when they gave up their nukes.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's what I meant by the softening of Gaddafi, shaking hands with certain Western.
Look what happens to countries that give up their nuclear program under Western pressure.
Right. And it gave him a sort of like, maybe for certain rebels, or like, in the country, it made him like, oh, maybe Gaddafi's not as tough as he used to be, looking at it in like a simplistic sort of way, and
well, in an even more simplistic sort of way, NATO would never have bombed Libya if Gaddafi had a nuke.
If he had a nuke, right, and that's why you don't get rid of your nuclear weapons.
But what made the difference is not that there was resistance to Gaddafi. I mean, there had always been some sort of Western-backed resistance to Gaddafi for a long time. What made the difference is that the U.S. government declared support for resistance to Gaddafi and bombed Libya via NATO. And the NATO intervention allowed not just the rebellion against Gaddafi, but the worst elements of the rebellion against Gaddafi to come to the fore. And the people who the U.S. tried to set up as a quote-unquote democratic Libya would have been entirely reliant on NATO to control the same rebellious elements that killed Gaddafi.
Yeah.
And NATO was not willing to commit that kind of force to maintain order in Libya after inflicting disorder on it. And so you bring back, and so what happens is the worst possible people with no checks from either the former government nor the people who destroyed the former government immediately have a chance to seize power wherever they can.
And you look from the United States aspect, look at all the effort that they put into Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yes.
Setting up a United States, puppet state, and all the effort in the years that the United States put into that. And
what happened?
Shit show.
What happened when the U.S. was no longer maintaining enough of a presence on the streets of Iraqi cities to control the government? It became pro-Iran because that's the demographics of that part of the world.
It's Shiite majority in Iraq.
Shiite majority, and in fact. The reason that Saddam Hussein again was in power was because under the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, and Saddam Hussein changed this in ways that made his overthrow possible. And that's almost another show. But there was a power sharing agreement in Iraq, very similar to that in Syria, whereas the Ba'ath Party, which was a majority Sunni party, had power in a majority Shiite country because they respected Shiite proportional representation in specific parts of the government.
Right.
Saddam Hussein changed that and started actively repressing Shiites and driving them and discriminating against them in government in ways that disrupted that power sharing agreement, which is the whole reason that it was possible to overthrow him in the first place. But that Shiite majority was not pro-Western because they saw Saddam Hussein as pro-Western.
Oh, okay. With that, the war, I don't want to keep going back to
because remember, Saddam Hussein is the guy who changed sides from being a Soviet ally to an American ally during the Iran-Iraq war.
Right, it was good. Yeah. So, right now with Syria, do you think this HTS group, is this really what's going to be like the government that's going to run Syria eventually?
Well, the people who are running things now seem to be like
keeping a tight lid on what they're truly.
They seem to be the ISIS al-Nusra people under a new name.
Basically, yeah. They moderated,
And all the groups, and this part I find interesting, all the groups that were helping the U.S. fight both Assad and ISIS when the U.S. was really, really involved, started helping Assad fight this group after the U.S. left. So all the formerly pro-U.S. groups were fighting these guys with Assad because the U.S. had abandoned them under Trump and Biden. Which is just because they were, whatever their different... we seem to have lost Robert for a moment. Hopefully he will be back. What I was going to say is there seems to be a difference in the way that the U.S. treats different factions. And hopefully we'll be able to get Robert back in a moment or two. I don't always know what to believe about Syria because obviously the Western media isn't telling the truth about it. But the anti-establishment media doesn't always seem completely trustworthy. And so I end up looking for foreign media that helps me sort of sift through everything and try to make independent decisions. And it's hard because you don't know whose propaganda to believe. I would rather admit what I don't know about Syria than pretend to know everything. But the history is that they're one of the few secular states in the region. They're one of the few states with a lip service commitment to socialism in the region. They're one of the last Arab nationalist states in the region with some sort of lip service to pan-Arabism. And their destruction is tremendously beneficial to the United States divide and rule strategy in the Middle East, where we support bad actors like Saudi Arabia and Turkey in the Muslim world in order to bully other countries into doing what we want and maintain a settler colonial outpost like Israel as a way to bomb all the people we don't want to bomb ourselves. And Syria, on paper, was one of the things standing against that, and now that regime is gone, and it's replaced by a regime that's going to be trying to make nice with the West for basic economic reasons now that the Russians aren't there anymore. So it's a big imperialist win for U.S. foreign policy in a way that's bad for the world. And at the same time, it's hard to imagine how a guy who was an ISIS terrorist of a couple of years ago is going to be good for the people of Syria. Now, what ISIS wants is a caliphate. ISIS's number one target isn't Israel, but all the other factions in the Islamic world that want their own caliphate, whether it's Iran or Saudi Arabia or Turkey. So ISIS's primary mission is to kill other Muslims. And then also, of course, they oppose the United States as a secondary figure and commit acts against the U.S. that seem to benefit both the U.S. national security state and ISIS's credibility with Muslims in the West, which doesn't seem like it's good for the Middle East either. And that's where I am. So far, it doesn't look like Robert is going to be able to make it back. I'm only so good at filling up content time on my own, for which I apologize if I end up having to cut it short. I'm trying to think something else as far as history. But no, again, just for the general background, Egypt, Syria, and Iraq were the three fundamentally pro-Arab regimes. Egypt was turned to being pro-Western under Jimmy Carter in the U.S. and Anwar Sadat in Egypt. The guy who was overthrown in the Arab Spring, Hosni Mubarak, was a police state thug who kept order for the U.S. empire. The Arab Spring government ended up being controlled by a majority coalition whose leader was the head of the Muslim Brotherhood at the time, who died in Egyptian prison after al-Sisi took over. And so, the anti-Western forces in Egypt have been destroyed, at least for the moment. You look at Iraq, Iraq has been destroyed. The government of Iraq is sort of a satellite of Iran, but the U.S. has a military presence there that it refuses to completely withdraw. And therefore, Iraq is in this sort of limbo where they're not completely independent, even though That was the whole point of the United States intervention, allegedly. And now Syria has been destroyed in the same way that Iraq was destroyed. And we're seeing an ISIS dictatorship, a formerly ISIS dictator, replace the so-called anti-Western dictator. And so all of this seems like it can't possibly be better for the material conditions of the people in Syria than it was before. It doesn't even completely seem like all the fighting is going to be over. There are going to be people who are going to want to maintain their autonomy from this ISIS government. So we'll still see fighting. We'll just pretend it's over or support ISIS again, ironically. That's what I see from the U.S. I don't know. Trump may ignore the Middle East entirely to start his trade war with China. Remember, Biden continued Trump's trade war with China while letting Israel bomb everything in the Middle East so we didn't have to. And this feels like it's one more thing that lets the U.S. worry more about China and less about the Middle East and Europe, especially if we really are trying to push Zelensky into not relying on American blank checks anymore and sort of letting him go down in flames if that's what it takes. Only the future will tell. I will say that we do need to keep supporting Palestinians who are still being genocided. We need to remember that Israel has not kept their ceasefire with the new Lebanese government. The president of Lebanon has the new incoming president of Lebanon, he took office on the 9th, has promised an end to the Israeli occupation, which is very aggressive language. We'll have to see what that actually means. It may mean that, Lebanon may try to do something about Israel's violations of the ceasefire. We'll have to see. I don't know. That doesn't make the region safer. It doesn't make it seem like the U.S. will stop letting Israel bomb anyone anytime soon if that's the case. So keep watching the Middle East, keep supporting the Palestinians. Remember, the fires on the West Coast are a complete symptom of the breakdown of our government's ability to take care of anybody, whether it be the poor or the rich. And that we're getting to the point where being a member of the well-off middle class, by which I mean millionaires for the most part, will not protect you from the billionaires anymore. And the rest of us who think we might be middle class really aren't the middle class or the millionaires. I think that's something that you have to realize the government believes. And until you realize the government believes that, you're going to be stuck thinking of yourself in a way that doesn't jibe with your material reality. And that's what I'd want to leave you on, is think about your material reality in relation to these systems and whether or not what politicians tell you about it is actually true. That's what I want to leave you with today. It doesn't look like Robert's going to be back. It is almost 9:00 Pacific time, noon Eastern. So I am going to need to call it a wrap. I apologize for what looks like technical difficulties, and I hope everybody has a great week and a great new year. And as always, I will tweet at you. Take care, folks, and have a good one.